I knew Christmas dinner would be uncomfortable, but I didn't expect my ex-husband to raise his wine glass, look at my fiancé, and say, "So this is the janitor? Maggie, you've really lowered your standards." The words floated above the table like smoke, thin and poisonous, and for a second I thought maybe I had misheard him, maybe the carols playing softly from the living room had distorted the sound, but then I saw the smirk on Richard's face and I knew exactly what he meant. The dining room glowed in warm white lights from the tree in the corner, the kind I used to string carefully every December for nearly 30 years of marriage, and the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the air, wrapping around us in what should have been comfort, but my chest felt tight instead, as if the room had quietly shrunk by a few feet. Daniel sat beside me, calm as ever, his navy blazer neat, his silver hair combed back, his hands folded loosely in his lap as though he were attending a school board meeting instead of walking straight into a firing line. Lauren let out a small laugh before she could stop herself, covering her mouth with her napkin, and Ethan didn't even bother pretending. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised, as if his father had just delivered a particularly clever joke. I felt the familiar sting of being the punchline, the same sting I had known in smaller doses for decades, only this time it landed harder because it wasn't just about me. Richard swirled the wine in his glass and added, "No offense, but I didn't think you'd end up with this," his hand gesturing vaguely toward Daniel as though he were pointing at a dented appliance on clearance. The chandelier above us reflected off the crystal glasses, scattering little sparks of light across the tablecloth, and I focused on those instead of the heat rising behind my eyes. I had set this table myself that afternoon, pressing the linen flat, polishing the silver, arranging the place cards in my careful script, determined to prove to myself that I could still host a beautiful Christmas even after the divorce, even after the quiet shift in loyalty that had placed my children permanently on their father's side of the room. Daniel had insisted on bringing a pecan pie from the bakery near his apartment, and he had carried it in with both hands like something fragile and precious, thanking me for inviting him, telling me he was honored to finally meet my family. He works as a custodian at Hawthorne Preparatory School, and he has never once hidden that fact. He talks about the students with pride, about how he keeps the floors shining and the hallways safe, about how every job deserves to be done well. I knew what Richard would see when he heard the word janitor. I knew he would translate it into failure, into lack, into a reflection of my supposed decline. Richard built his career in corporate administration, always chasing titles that sounded heavier than they were, and for years I mistook that ambition for strength. The first Christmas after our divorce, he hosted dinner at his new house across town, and I sat at the edge of the table like a distant relative rather than the woman who had once balanced the checkbook and baked every cookie from scratch. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was my turn to create something steady and warm, to show my children that my life had not diminished simply because my marriage had ended. But there it was again, that thin edge of contempt in Richard's voice, sharpened for an audience. "He's trash," Richard said suddenly, more clearly this time, the word landing with a dull thud against the polished wood of the table. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like a pause before applause, and then Ethan gave a short laugh and muttered, "Dad, come on," though there was no real protest in it. I watched Daniel's face carefully, waiting for the flinch, the tightening jaw, the defensive reply, but none of it came. Instead, he smiled, not a forced smile, not the brittle kind I had perfected over the years, but something softer, almost thoughtful, as if Richard had just made an interesting observation about the weather. He reached for his water glass, took a small sip, and said nothing at all. That silence unsettled me more than any argument would have, because it shifted the rhythm of the room. Richard's grin faltered for half a second, as though he had expected resistance and found himself pushing against air. I felt my pulse steady slightly, curiosity replacing humiliation, and I realized that while I had braced myself for mockery, Daniel had walked in without armor. He had told me earlier, while we sat in his car outside the house, that respect says more about the person offering it than the one receiving it, and at the time I thought he was simply trying to reassure me, but now I began to wonder if he understood something deeper about rooms like this one, about men like Richard. The tree lights blinked in slow patterns, red to gold to white, reflecting in the window behind Richard's head, and for the first time that evening, I noticed a faint crease forming between his eyebrows. Daniel set his glass down carefully and looked across the table, meeting Richard's gaze without hostility, without apology, as if the word trash had drifted past him without sticking. I had spent years shrinking in moments like this, smoothing things over, changing the subject, protecting my children from tension they pretended not to see, but something in Daniel's composure kept me still. I folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch just a few seconds longer than was comfortable, aware that this Christmas dinner had already become something else entirely, something that would not be remembered for the turkey or the pie or the carols humming faintly from the speakers, but for a single word tossed carelessly across a table and the unexpected calm of the man it was meant to wound. The silence did not break all at once, it thinned slowly, like ice under steady sunlight, and I could almost hear the careful shifting of forks against china as everyone searched for a safer topic. Richard cleared his throat and took another sip of wine as though he had simply commented on the weather, and Lauren leaned forward to ask Daniel where he worked, her tone dipped in a sweetness that felt rehearsed. Daniel answered plainly that he worked at Hawthorne Preparatory School, that he had been there for several years, that he enjoyed the early mornings before the students arrived because the hallways were quiet and the building felt full of possibility. Ethan nodded in a way that suggested polite tolerance, and I saw the unspoken comparison forming in his mind, the invisible scale weighing titles and salaries and square footage. I reached for the gravy boat, my hands steady. Now, and poured a careful line across my mashed potatoes, focusing on small, ordinary movements that reminded me I was still in control of something. Richard set his glass down with a faint click and said, "Hawthorne is a fine school. I hear the tuition is nearly $30,000 a year," as if the number itself were a verdict. Daniel smiled again and said that the school expected excellence from everyone, including the people who kept it running behind the scenes. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only calm certainty, and that calmness unsettled Richard more than any argument could have. I had watched that look on Richard's face before, the slight tightening around his mouth when a conversation did not follow his script, when someone refused to shrink in the space he had carved out for them. For most of our marriage, that someone had been me. I used to counter his sharper comments with nervous laughter, apologizing for things that did not require apology, smoothing over his impatience in front of the children so they would not see the crack forming in the foundation of our home. Tonight, I felt that old instinct stir inside me, the urge to rescue the evening, to change the subject to the cranberry sauce recipe or the new lights on the porch, but I stayed quiet. The tree lights blinked softly behind us, reflecting in the window where my own face appeared faintly superimposed over the room, and for a moment I studied that reflection. I looked older than I did in my memory, of course, 62 years do not pass without leaving their mark, but I also looked steadier. Daniel reached for the bread basket and offered it to Lauren first, a small gesture of courtesy that she accepted without meeting his eyes. Richard leaned back in his chair and asked Daniel how long he planned to stay in that position, as if it were a temporary inconvenience rather than a job. Daniel replied that he believed in doing meaningful work, and that meaningful work did not always come with a corner office. The words landed gently, yet I could feel the shift in the air, the slight recalibration of power that occurs when someone refuses to be measured by another person's yardstick. Ethan checked his phone under the table, the faint glow lighting his face, and I wondered if he realized how closely he mirrored his father in moments like this. I thought about the years when Ethan would run into the kitchen after school, telling me about his science projects and soccer practice, when Lauren would sit at the counter while I baked cookies, asking if I thought she would ever move to New York City. Back then, I believed that love would be enough to hold us together, that the small daily rituals of family life would outweigh the sharper edges of ambition and pride. Yet as I watched them now, I saw how easily admiration for success had blurred into dismissal of simplicity. Daniel asked Ethan about his work in real estate, genuinely interested, and Ethan brightened immediately, explaining the square footage of the latest property he had sold, the granite countertops, the open floor plan, the 4-car garage. Daniel listened without interruption, nodding thoughtfully, asking how the market had shifted over the past year. There was no competition in his tone, only curiosity, and that disarmed me in a way I had not expected. Richard glanced at me as if waiting for discomfort to bloom across my face, as if he wanted confirmation that I felt embarrassed by the man beside me, but what I felt instead was a slow, steady warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the living room. I realized that for the first time in many Christmases, I was not bracing myself for the next remark. The word trash still echoed faintly in my mind, but it no longer carried the same weight. It felt smaller now, like an object dropped from a height that had shattered on impact rather than the target it was meant to strike. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, simple silver ones that caught the light, and asked Richard whether he was still serving on the board at Hawthorne. The question was mild, almost casual, but it landed differently than the others. Richard paused, just briefly, before answering that yes, he was involved in an advisory capacity, that he offered strategic input when requested. I noticed the way his shoulders straightened as he spoke, the subtle pride in claiming affiliation with an institution that signaled status. Daniel nodded once, as if filing that information away, and returned his attention to his plate. The room felt altered now, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that I sensed an undercurrent forming beneath the polite exchanges. I had expected humiliation to define the evening, to hang over me like a cloud, but instead I felt something else taking shape, something quieter and more powerful, as though the story unfolding at my own dining table was not quite the one Richard believed he was telling. Richard did not return to the subject of Hawthorne immediately, but I could see that the question had settled somewhere behind his eyes, like a pebble dropped into a still pond whose ripples had not yet reached the shore. Dessert plates were cleared and replaced with slices of pecan pie, the crust golden and flaky, and Daniel thanked me again for warming it in the oven before serving. Lauren commented that it was surprisingly good for something store-bought, and I noticed the faint emphasis on the word store as if she were measuring worth in homemade effort versus purchased convenience. I poured coffee into porcelain cups I had owned since my first anniversary, the thin rims delicate against my fingers, and listened as Richard began recounting a recent fundraising gala at Hawthorne. He described the ballroom in detail, the string quartet near the entrance, the auction items that had raised more than $200,000 in a single evening, and the donors whose names carried weight in the city. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed proximity to prestige could not be questioned. Daniel listened carefully, asking a few precise questions about the scholarship program and the renovation of the science wing. Richard seemed pleased at first, assuming admiration, but when Daniel inquired about the new facilities management contract, a subtle pause entered the conversation. Richard answered that the school had recently restructured its operational oversight, that efficiency was a priority. Daniel nodded slowly and said that efficient leadership always began with understanding the foundation of an institution, not only its surface. The words were gentle, yet I felt them settle into the room with quiet significance. Ethan glanced between them, perhaps sensing the undercurrent he could not yet name. I found myself studying Daniel's posture, the ease with which he occupied his chair, as if he had nothing to prove and therefore nothing to defend. For years I had associated power with volume, with the ability to dominate a room through sharper words or louder laughter, but Daniel's power seemed to operate in reverse, growing stronger the less he displayed it. Richard finally set his fork down and said, with a hint of challenge in his voice, "You seem to know quite a bit about how Hawthorne operates for someone who cleans its hallways." The remark hovered just above civility, polished enough to pass as curiosity, pointed enough to carry insult. I felt a tightening in my stomach, the old reflex of anticipating humiliation, but Daniel did not shift. He rested his hands on the table and met Richard's gaze evenly. "I believe every institution deserves attention from top to bottom," he said, "because what happens at ground level determines how strong the structure stands." The simplicity of the statement left little room for mockery. The fire in the living room crackled softly, and outside the window I could see a thin layer of snow beginning to coat the front lawn, turning the streetlights into hazy halos. Lauren asked if anyone wanted more coffee, her voice slightly too bright, as though she wished to dilute the tension. I realized then that the evening was no longer about status or embarrassment, it had become a quiet contest of composure. Richard leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said that Hawthorne was fortunate to have dedicated staff at every level. Daniel thanked him politely, then asked how long Richard had been serving in his advisory role. "Since the restructuring," Richard replied, emphasizing the word since as if it marked an elevation. Daniel inclined his head in acknowledgement, and for a brief second, I saw something like calculation flicker across Richard's face. It occurred to me that Richard had always relied on certainty, on the assumption that he understood the hierarchy of any room he entered. Yet here, in my dining room beneath the glow of Christmas lights I had strung with my own hands, that hierarchy felt less stable. I thought about the years I had deferred to Richard's version of reality, the way I had allowed his perspective to define my worth. Tonight, however, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness, not because I anticipated triumph, but because I sensed that truth did not require theatrics. Daniel reached for his coat draped over the back of his chair, retrieving a small leather card holder, and placed it beside his plate without comment. He did not slide it forward. Did not announce its significance, simply let it rest there like an unopened envelope. Richard's eyes flicked toward it, curiosity sharpening his expression. I felt the air change again, subtle but undeniable, as if the balance of the evening had tipped by a fraction of an inch. The children fell quiet, their earlier laughter replaced by watchful silence. I realized that whatever was about to unfold would not resemble the kind of confrontation Richard expected. It would not be loud or dramatic. It would be measured, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And for the first time in many Christmases, I was not afraid of what came next. Richard's gaze settled on the small leather card holder as though it were an object out of place, something that did not belong among the pie plates and coffee cups, and I saw the exact moment curiosity edged out his confidence. Daniel did not rush to explain it. He simply brushed an invisible crumb from the tablecloth and leaned back slightly in his chair, as if the evening were proceeding exactly as he had anticipated. The quiet stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like gravity slowly asserting itself. Richard finally spoke, his voice lighter than before but edged with suspicion, asking whether Daniel carried business cards for custodial services now. The remark was meant to restore balance, to bring the conversation back to a hierarchy he understood. Daniel smiled, not broadly, not triumphantly, just enough to suggest patience. He opened the card holder and slid a single card across the polished wood toward Richard. The motion was smooth, deliberate, almost gentle. The card stopped just inches from Richard's wine glass. I could not see the text from where I sat, but I watched Richard's expression instead. At first, there was indifference. Then a brief narrowing of his eyes. Then stillness. The color in his face shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that even Lauren noticed. Ethan leaned forward, trying to glimpse the card without appearing obvious. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the heating system and the soft ticking of the clock above the doorway. Richard cleared his throat and picked up the card, holding it between his fingers as though verifying its weight. He read it once. Then again. His shoulders, which had been squared in easy authority all evening, seemed to lower by an inch. Daniel folded his hands calmly in front of him and waited. No announcement followed. No dramatic reveal. Just silence. Finally, Richard set the card back down carefully, as if it required a certain respect. Chairman, Hawthorne Education Holdings, he read aloud, his voice missing its earlier ease. I felt my heartbeat steady rather than race, which surprised me. I had expected shock, perhaps even vindication to surge through me, but what I felt instead was clarity. Daniel did not look at me for reassurance. He did not look at the children for validation. He looked only at Richard and said that he preferred to keep his role private because titles often distracted from the work itself. The words were simple, but they landed with undeniable weight. Ethan blinked rapidly, processing the shift in status. Lauren's posture changed subtly, her earlier amusement replaced with uncertainty. Richard attempted a laugh, a thin sound that did not quite fill the space. He said that he had not realized Daniel was involved at that level. Daniel nodded and replied that involvement did not always require visibility. The fire cracked again in the living room, and outside the snow had begun to fall more steadily, blanketing the street in quiet white. I realized that the word trash no longer belonged in the room. It had dissolved into something smaller, something irrelevant. Richard asked how long Daniel had held that position, and Daniel answered that he had been the principal investor for nearly a decade, long before the recent restructuring. The timeline hung there between them, undeniable. Richard's advisory role suddenly seemed narrower, less commanding. I saw the calculation in his eyes as he reconsidered past meetings, past decisions, wondering perhaps how many times Daniel had been present in ways he had not recognized. Daniel explained calmly that he believed in understanding every aspect of the institutions he supported, including the maintenance staff, because leadership without awareness was fragile. He spoke without accusation, without pride, simply stating what he believed. I felt something shift inside me as well, not because Daniel possessed influence, but because he had endured insult without flinching. For years I had mistaken loudness for authority. Tonight I was witnessing something different. Lauren reached for her coffee cup and held it with both hands, as if steadying herself. Ethan glanced at his father, waiting for a response. That would restore equilibrium, but none came. Richard finally said that he had been unaware of Daniel's broader involvement. Daniel responded that awareness often depended on perspective. The sentence was not sharp, yet it cut through the last remnants of condescension. I looked around my dining room, at the lights I had hung, at the plates I had arranged, and realized that the power in the room had not shifted because of wealth or title alone. It had shifted because composure had met arrogance and refused to bend. Richard adjusted his tie, a small, habitual gesture, and said that this was unexpected news. Daniel inclined his head slightly and replied that unexpected truths often revealed more than planned performances. No one laughed this time. No one reached for another joke. The evening had taken on a stillness that felt almost reverent. And in that stillness, I understood that the humiliation I had feared was no longer mine to carry. No one reached for the card again. It remained on the table between the coffee cups and dessert plates like a quiet correction that did not need to repeat itself. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a movement I had seen countless times in boardrooms and banquet halls, the gesture he used when he needed to recover control. He offered a thin smile and said that he supposed congratulations were in order, though his tone carried the faint strain of recalculation. Daniel thanked him politely and added that titles were only useful when they supported good decisions. There was no edge in his voice, no hint of retaliation, only steadiness. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by curiosity. He asked Daniel how someone moved from custodial work into educational investment, and for the first time that evening, there was no laughter behind the question. Daniel explained that he had begun his career in facilities management while studying finance at night, taking community college classes after long shifts, saving carefully, investing cautiously. He said that understanding the ground level of an institution had taught him where waste occurred and where value truly lived. I watched my son absorb those words, watched the subtle shift in his posture as the narrative he had accepted only an hour earlier dissolved. Lauren asked quietly why Daniel still chose to work in the hallways if he did not need the income. Daniel answered that remaining present kept him honest. He said that leadership could become distorted when separated from daily realities, and that he preferred to stay close to the people whose work often went unnoticed. The simplicity of that explanation filled the room more completely than any boast could have. I felt the warmth of the fire at my back and realized that the humiliation I had braced for had transformed into something else entirely. Richard attempted to redirect the conversation toward market forecasts and expansion plans, but the authority in his voice had softened. Each sentence sounded less like command and more like inquiry. Daniel responded respectfully, never dismissing him, never raising his voice, yet the hierarchy had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I saw Ethan glance at the card once more, as if memorizing the name printed there, and Lauren folded her napkin carefully, avoiding my eyes. For years I had believed that dignity required defense, that silence meant surrender. Tonight I was learning that silence could also be strength when it rested on certainty. Daniel eventually picked up the card and slipped it back into the holder without flourish. He did not linger on the revelation, did not press the advantage. Instead, he asked Lauren about her recent design project and complimented Ethan on navigating a challenging housing market. The conversation resumed, but it felt different now, stripped of pretense. Outside, the snowfall had thickened, covering the driveway in a soft white layer that reflected the porch light in a muted glow. I imagined the morning to come, the clean landscape untouched by footprints, and the image felt symbolic in a way I did not yet fully understand. Richard rose to refill his glass, though he barely drank from it afterward. When he sat down again, his posture carried less certainty and more awareness. He cleared his throat and said that Hawthorne was fortunate to have dedicated leadership at every level. The phrasing was careful, measured. Daniel inclined his head, accepting the acknowledgement without triumph. I looked around the table at the faces I had known for decades and realized that respect had not entered the room with noise, it had entered quietly, earned rather than demanded. Ethan finally met my eyes, and there was something new in his expression, something closer to reflection than amusement. Lauren offered to help clear the dishes, her tone softer than before. The evening did not explode into apologies or dramatic admissions. Instead, it settled into a calmer rhythm, as though the foundation beneath it had shifted into something sturdier. I felt a gentle steadiness inside me, not because of Daniel's position or wealth, but because he had refused to become small when invited to do so. For years I had measured myself against Richard's approval, adjusting my voice, my opinions, my choices to fit within his frame. Tonight, that frame felt irrelevant. As we gathered plates and carried them toward the kitchen, Daniel walked beside me, his presence quiet but assured. He did not whisper reassurances or seek validation. He simply moved with the same calm dignity he had displayed all evening. And in the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting off the window glass, I understood that the greatest reversal had not been Richard's loss of dominance. It had been my decision to stop shrinking in order to keep the peace. The dishes clinked softly as Lauren rinsed them at the sink, her movements quieter than usual, and I dried each plate with a linen towel that had survived more holidays than I cared to count. The rhythm of washing and drying steadied the room in a way conversation no longer could. Behind us, Ethan stood near the counter, scrolling through his phone, but I could tell he was not reading anything. His thumb hovered in the same place for several seconds at a time. Daniel remained at the dining table with Richard, not in confrontation but in composed discussion, their voices low and even. I could not hear every word, yet I noticed the absence of tension. There was no raised volume, no defensive posture. Just two men recalibrating their understanding of each other. When I carried the last stack of plates into the cabinet, I felt a quiet awareness settle inside me. For years, after gatherings with Richard, would replay every comment in my mind on the drive home, measuring my responses, wishing I had spoken differently, wishing I had been smaller or larger depending on what might have preserved harmony. Tonight, I did not feel that urge. I felt still. Lauren dried her hands and turned toward me, hesitating before speaking. She said she had not realized Daniel was involved at that level. I answered that not everything valuable announces itself. The words came out gently, without accusation. She nodded, as if absorbing more than the sentence itself. Ethan finally stepped closer and asked how long I had known about Daniel's position. I told him that Daniel had mentioned it early in our relationship but had never led with it. Ethan frowned slightly, perhaps reconsidering his earlier laughter. In the living room, Richard's voice carried faintly as he asked Daniel about upcoming board decisions. Daniel responded in measured tones, offering insight without dominance. The house felt different now, not larger, not brighter, but steadier. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the porch railing in a clean layer of white. I imagined the driveway in the morning, smooth and unmarked, waiting for new steps. When I returned to the table, Richard looked up at me with an expression I could not immediately read. It was not apology, not quite, but it lacked the earlier certainty that had defined him. He said that Hawthorne would benefit from more transparent communication at the leadership level. Daniel agreed calmly and added that transparency was most effective when paired with humility. The statement was not directed at anyone, yet it settled into the room with quiet clarity. Richard gave a short nod. No further challenge followed. Instead, the conversation drifted toward lighter topics: winter travel plans, Lauren's design clients, Ethan's upcoming property listing. The earlier hierarchy no longer dictated the tone. I poured fresh coffee and handed a cup to Daniel. Our fingers brushed briefly, a simple contact that grounded me more than any triumphant speech could have. He did not squeeze my hand or whisper reassurance. He did not need to. His presence had already shifted the foundation of the evening. After a while, coats were gathered from the hallway rack, scarves looped carefully around necks. Ethan lingered near the doorway and said that he had been impressed by Daniel's background. The admission was understated, yet sincere. Lauren hugged me more tightly than she had upon arrival, and I sensed reflection in her embrace. Richard paused before stepping onto the porch. The cold air rushed in as he opened the door, carrying the scent of fresh snow. He looked back once, as though measuring the distance between who he believed himself to be and who he had just encountered. He said that it had been an interesting evening. Daniel responded that growth often began with unexpected moments. The door closed gently behind them, and silence returned to the house, this time without tension. I stood in the quiet living room, watching the lights on the tree blink steadily, and felt a sense of balance I had not experienced in years. The word trash no longer echoed in my mind. It had dissolved into insignificance, replaced by something steadier and more durable. Daniel stepped beside me and asked softly if I was all right. I answered that I was more than all right. I was certain. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints left on the walkway, smoothing over the path that had led to this evening. And as I watched the white layer deepen under the porch light, I realized that the greatest change had not been in Richard's expression or my children's reactions. It had been in me. I no longer felt the need to defend my choices or justify my worth. I had brought Daniel to this table knowing he would be underestimated, and he had answered that underestimation with calm dignity. In doing so, he had given me something far greater than vindication. He had given me perspective. And for the first time in many Christmases, I felt that my home, my table, and my life belonged entirely to me. The house felt unusually quiet after the door closed behind them, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to a new understanding. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the snow settle into a smooth white blanket across the front yard, covering the tire tracks and footprints that had marked the evening. The porch light cast a soft glow over the driveway, and I imagined Richard walking carefully toward his car, his polished shoes pressing into the fresh layer of snow, leaving impressions that would disappear by morning. Daniel began gathering the empty cups from the coffee table, moving with the same steady composure he had carried all night. There was no triumph in his posture, no subtle celebration. He simply carried the dishes into the kitchen and placed them neatly beside the sink. I followed him, turning off the dining room chandelier as I passed, the crystals dimming one by one until only the tree lights remained. For a long time, Christmas had felt like a performance for me, a carefully arranged display meant to reassure everyone that our family was intact. Even after the divorce, I had maintained that performance, hoping that if I decorated the tree perfectly and set the table just right, I could preserve a sense of normalcy. Tonight, that illusion had quietly dissolved. Daniel dried his hands with a towel and looked at me with a question in his eyes, not about the evening's outcome, but about my well-being. I told him I felt calm, and I realized it was true. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel victorious. I felt settled. The earlier insult, sharp and humiliating in its delivery, now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. What remained was not the sting of Richard's words but the clarity that followed them. I walked back into the living room and adjusted one of the ornaments that had tilted on the tree. It was a small glass angel Ethan had made in elementary school, its edges uneven but carefully painted. I remembered the pride in his voice when he had handed it to me, insisting that it belonged at the very front of the tree. I wondered how that little boy had grown into a man who laughed at the word trash when it was aimed at someone I cared about. Perhaps it was not cruelty but habit, the reflex of aligning with the louder voice in the room. I had done the same once. I had aligned with Richard's certainty even when it diminished me. Daniel joined me near the fireplace and commented on how peaceful the snowfall looked. I nodded, noticing how the world outside seemed untouched by the evening's tension. He said that power often reveals itself in silence rather than sound, and I thought about how different this Christmas felt compared to so many before it. In the past, any disagreement with Richard would have escalated into a contest of volume, a subtle battle for dominance disguised as conversation. Tonight, there had been no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just a quiet shift that changed everything. My phone vibrated softly on the coffee table. A message from Lauren appeared, sent only minutes after she left. It read that she had not realized how much she had assumed about Daniel and that she would like to talk more soon. A second message followed from Ethan, shorter but equally telling. He wrote that he had been impressed and that perhaps they had misjudged. I set the phone down without replying immediately. Apologies, when they come, should be met with patience rather than triumph. Daniel sat beside me on the sofa, and we watched the fire settle into glowing embers. I thought about the years I had spent measuring myself against Richard's standards, adjusting my preferences, my friendships, even my tone of voice to maintain his approval. That approval had once felt essential, like oxygen. Tonight, I understood that it had always been conditional. Respect rooted in fear or superiority dissolves quickly. Respect grounded in steadiness endures. Daniel reached for my hand, not to reassure me but simply to connect, and I felt no need to explain the weight of the evening. He had seen it. He had understood it. The snow continued to fall outside, thick enough now to erase the outlines of the lawn entirely. By morning, the world would look renewed, as if the ground itself had chosen to begin again. I realized that the true reversal of the evening was not the exposure of Daniel's position or Richard's recalibration. It was my refusal to shrink. I had hosted Christmas on my own terms. I had brought a man I respected into my home despite knowing he would be underestimated. And when the test came, I had not rushed to defend, apologize, or smooth over discomfort. I had remained still. As the clock above the mantel ticked toward midnight, I felt something settle into place inside me, something steady and unshakable. The evening had begun with a word meant to belittle. It had ended with quiet understanding. And as I turned off the last of the lights and let the house rest beneath the glow of the tree, I knew that whatever conversations followed in the days ahead would unfold on different ground than before. Morning arrived quietly, the world outside transformed into a landscape of white that reflected the pale winter sun through the living room windows. I woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness but from a sense of anticipation I could not immediately name. The house felt different in the daylight, stripped of candlelight and tension, revealing only clean surfaces and the soft glow of the tree I had left on overnight. I wrapped a wool sweater around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch, the snow compressing gently beneath my boots, leaving clear prints that marked my path to the mailbox. The air was crisp, sharp in my lungs, and the silence of the neighborhood felt complete, as if the entire street had paused. When I returned inside, I saw a new message on my phone from Ethan. He had written that he wanted to stop by later, alone, to talk. A separate message from Lauren asked if she could take me to lunch in the coming week. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and poured myself coffee, watching the steam rise in slow spirals. The events of the previous night did not replay in my mind with embarrassment. They unfolded with clarity. Daniel emerged from the guest room, his hair slightly tousled, and greeted me with a calm smile. He asked if I had slept well. I told him that I had, and I meant it. We stood together at the window, looking at the untouched snow across the yard. He said that winter often exposes what autumn tries to hide, and I understood that he was not only speaking of seasons. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived as promised. He stepped carefully across the driveway, his shoes leaving dark impressions against the white surface. When he entered, his usual confidence seemed muted. He declined coffee and stood near the fireplace, hands clasped together as though organizing his thoughts. He said that he had been thinking about the way he laughed the night before. He admitted that it had been automatic, that he had not paused to consider how it might feel. I listened without interruption. For years, I would have rushed to absolve him, to minimize the impact in order to keep peace. This time, I allowed silence to hold space. Ethan continued, saying that he had grown accustomed to measuring people by outward markers of success, and that perhaps he had inherited that habit without question. I told him that awareness was a beginning, not a conclusion. He nodded slowly. There was no dramatic apology, no theatrical reconciliation. Just recognition. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual, and I felt sincerity in the gesture. The next day, Lauren called instead of texting. She asked about Daniel, about how we met, about what I valued most in him. I answered honestly. I told her that I valued steadiness, humility, and the absence of competition. I said that I had spent too many years mistaking control for strength. There was a pause on the line, and then she admitted that she admired how Daniel handled the evening. She said she had never seen her father so uncertain. I replied that uncertainty could be instructive. Over the following week, the house returned to its ordinary rhythm. Decorations remained on the tree, but the tension that had once accompanied family gatherings no longer lingered in the corners. Daniel returned to his routine at Hawthorne, rising before dawn to arrive at the campus before students filled the hallways. He never altered that habit. When I visited him one afternoon, I watched him speak with maintenance staff and administrators alike with equal courtesy. No one there treated him as less. They understood his role, not because he announced it, but because his conduct revealed it. Richard did not call immediately, but eventually he sent a brief message acknowledging that he had underestimated Daniel. The wording was careful, almost formal. I did not respond with triumph. I responded with brevity. Respect does not require embellishment. As January unfolded, I noticed that conversations with my children shifted subtly. They asked more questions. They listened longer. The hierarchy that once defined our interactions had softened. And in the quiet of my living room, with snow melting slowly along the edges of the lawn, I recognized that the true transformation of Christmas had not been a public revelation of status. It had been the dismantling of an old pattern. I no longer feared bringing the full truth of my life to the table. I no longer braced for dismissal. And as I stood once more by the window watching the last traces of snow dissolve into the earth, I understood that dignity, once reclaimed, does not retreat. By the time February arrived, the last traces of snow had melted from the edges of the yard, leaving the grass damp and slightly flattened, as if the earth itself had endured a quiet season of pressure and release. Life did not change overnight after Christmas, but it shifted in subtle, undeniable ways. Ethan began calling more often, not out of obligation, but with genuine curiosity. He asked about Daniel's work at Hawthorne, about the decisions behind maintaining older buildings while expanding new programs, and I noticed that his questions carried respect rather than skepticism. Lauren invited Daniel and me to a small gallery opening she had helped design, and when she introduced him to her colleagues, she did not mention his title first. She spoke of his insight, of his commitment to education, of the way he valued every role within an organization. It was a small adjustment in language, but it revealed a larger transformation in perception. Richard remained more reserved. Weeks passed before he suggested meeting for coffee. We chose a neutral cafe downtown, a place with wide windows and wooden tables polished by years of use. He arrived on time, dressed in the same careful manner he had always favored, but there was less certainty in the way he carried himself. He spoke about Hawthorne's upcoming initiatives and acknowledged that he had underestimated Daniel's philosophy of leadership. He did not apologize directly for the word he had used at Christmas, yet he admitted that assumptions had clouded his judgment. I listened without interrupting, not because I feared confrontation, but because I no longer needed it. The insult that once would have lingered for months had lost its power. I realized that dignity does not demand public correction, it thrives quietly when truth reveals itself. Daniel continued to divide his time between administrative responsibilities and early morning rounds through the school corridors. I visited him one afternoon and watched as students greeted him by name, some unaware of his broader role, others fully aware yet treating him with the same warmth. There was no hierarchy in the way he returned their greetings. He adjusted a loose locker hinge, paused to ask a teacher about her classroom needs, and later stepped into a meeting with board members without altering his tone or posture. Observing him in that environment confirmed what I had begun to understand at my own dining table. Authority grounded in humility does not fluctuate with context. It remains consistent. As winter gave way to early spring, I felt lighter in ways that surprised me. Hosting gatherings no longer felt like a test. When I invited the family over for Sunday dinner in March, I did so without rehearsing possible remarks or preparing defenses. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, green beans, fresh bread, and the conversation moved easily. There were no barbed jokes, no subtle competitions. Ethan asked Daniel about scholarship expansions at Hawthorne, Lauren shared a new design contract she had secured, and Richard listened. More than he spoke. I noticed that when Daniel excused himself to help clear the plates, Ethan stood as well without prompting. Small gestures accumulate meaning. After everyone left that evening, I stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, the scent of baked bread lingering in the air. I remembered the woman I had been for so many years, measuring my worth against approval that could vanish with a single careless word. I remembered the tightness in my chest at past holidays, the rehearsed smiles, the constant adjustments. That version of me felt distant now, not erased, but integrated into a steadier understanding. The night Richard called Daniel trash had not defined me. It had revealed something. It had exposed how easily people cling to visible labels while overlooking substance. And it had shown me that I did not need to defend my choices with volume or argument. I needed only to stand beside them with certainty. One evening in April, as Daniel and I walked through a local park where cherry blossoms had begun to bloom, he asked if I regretted inviting him to Christmas dinner knowing what might happen. I told him that I had known there would be judgment, but I had trusted that truth would outlast it. He squeezed my hand gently, and we continued walking beneath branches heavy with pale petals drifting softly to the ground. The air carried the scent of early spring, clean and hopeful. I understood then that the most significant change had not occurred in Richard or even in my children. It had occurred within me. I no longer anticipated humiliation before entering a room. I no longer adjusted my life to preempt criticism. Respect, once reclaimed, becomes a quiet anchor. And as the seasons shifted and the memory of that Christmas evening softened into perspective, I carried with me a certainty that did not depend on titles, laughter, or apology. It depended only on knowing who I was and refusing to become smaller to fit someone else's measure.